Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Bill Harmer, the Executive Director of the Westport Library. Tonight, I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming fellow Westporter Trey Ellis to join us for an in-depth conversation about his critically acclaimed HBO documentary, King in the Wilderness, which focuses on the final chapters of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s life, revealing a conflicted leader who faced an onslaught of criticism from both sides of the political spectrum. Mr. Ellis is an American Book Award-winning novelist, a Peabody Award winner, and Emmy-nominated screenwriter, playwright, and associate professor of screenwriting in the Graduate School of Film at Columbia University. His works have been screened at the Museum of Modern Art and at the Brooklyn Academy of Music. His first play, Fly, was commissioned and performed at the Lincoln Center Institute and played around the country, including the historic Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., the Pasadena Playhouse, and the New Victory Theater on 42nd Street in New York City. Mr. Ellis is a masterful screenwriter who continues to teach screenwriting around the world and has taught or lectured at NYU, Yale, Harvard, and the University of New Mexico. He has also written screenplays for Paramount, Sony, and Touchstone Pictures, and has developed television programs for USA Networks. The multi-talented Mr. Ellis will be joined tonight by another fellow Westporter and good friend, Harold Bailey. Harold is currently the chair of Team Westport. With members appointed by First Selectman Jim Marpy, Team Westport's focus is on achieving and celebrating a more welcoming, multicultural community, as well as engaging the community in and drawing attention to issues surrounding multiculturalism and diversity, making the invisible visible. Trey and Harold, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Bill. And Trey, I have to say, since everyone on tonight has already seen the film, thank you so much for this incredible work. It's about the fourth time I've seen it, and every time I see it, it hits me even harder. It's just so powerful. Just to go back and just recap, of course, what the film is focused on is the last 18 months of Dr. King's life. But not only that last 18 months, but with a number of the key people who were around him at that time, who were still alive in 2018 when the film was made. I think also in terms of the real delivery there for a lot of people who aren't old enough to have lived through this time frame is the idea of what really was going on for Dr. King just before he died. Alex, would you mind showing the graphic? Okay, this is my grandson. and this is obviously the monument to Dr. King in Washington. I put it up to say that for most of us, and for most of the people, certainly those that didn't live through the time when Dr. King was here on Earth with us, this is what we think of ourselves versus Dr. King, who was this incredible giant icon who was revered by everyone here in the United States and globally. And to find out in this film that the reality in 1967 and 68 was that he was probably one of the most hated men in America at that point in time it's a real reveal. I remember as someone who was growing up then as a teenager and excited about all the work that had gone on with Dr. King. We'd heard about Birmingham, about Montgomery, the bus boycott. My church had been involved in supporting folks down in Alabama. I'm from Tennessee, and I grew up in a segregated environment back then. And then to get excited and get older in the high school and see all of the changes coming along, and then to see Dr. King kind of switch lanes as far as I was concerned, and get into Vietnam and issues around that, when segregation in the South was still alive, still thriving. In fact, in the 10th grade, I integrated a school. I was one of a dozen kids who integrated a high school in Knoxville, Tennessee, and we had catcalls and parents out every morning not just giving us dirty looks, but yelling at our parents, yelling at us as we were going into the school. So we knew, we lived the fact that this was still going on and it was still alive and well. And there was a real feeling of kind of a betrayal almost when the focus changed to Vietnam. The focus changed to something other than segregation in the South. The question that we had was, why was Dr. King changing his focus? And I would say that this film answers that question brilliantly. But Trey, my question is, how did you come to deciding to tell this story?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly, you hit the nail. To me, the idea of when we were approached to do this film about to the 50th anniversary of his assassination, we didn't want to just do another, like, here's the guy on the monument. I think people, conflate, we forget history so soon after it's happened. So, there's generations that see Thomas Jefferson, Dr. King, and Malcolm X sort of on a continuum, so we wanted to say, how could we reintroduce him, the real man, just as you're saying, like, especially at his most divisive. It's like, so the day he died, he was, as you pointed out, never less popular with whites and blacks alike. And that sense of, that's why I came up with this title that I like so much, of King in the Wilderness. He felt like he was wandering in the wilderness, really not questioning his faith, but questioning, like, that his most effective days had been behind him, and that that he really lost his effectiveness as a leader. I think he had no conception the day that he died that sort of the lasting impact he would have, really more than almost any, as Andrew Young says, like, the best that's ever done it, in terms of really, yes, he would say, moving the moral arc of our nation towards justice. He leaned on that arc and precipitated that sort of some degrees of change more than anyone in history.
Amen. Well, was this your concept initially alone that you had, or was it?
No, I mean, I'd done a little bit of dabbling in documentary work, but mainly I'd been doing feature work and writing novels and things. And then my friend, a childhood friend of mine from New Haven, Hamden in New Haven, where I grew up, when he was at Yale, Professor Henry Louis Gates was talking with the Kuhnhardts who made the film, and they said, the director there, Peter Kuhnhardt, had a bad back, and he said, you're looking for someone to do these interviews. Would I be interested? And I said, wow, I would love to. Just the idea of being able to travel the country for a year and sit down for 2 or 3 hours at a time with these superheroes of mine, it was really a dream come true. But I said to them, I don't want to make it again like this, some kind of hagiography. I want to only do this if we can really get to the truth, not sidestep and skirt like the infidelity and the depression and all these things that I'd studied in college, because I was lucky enough at Stanford that my professor was Clay Carson, who's the preeminent King scholar, and he is actually the King Papers are at Stanford, and he is the director of the King Papers. So I knew really well the story that we're telling here, but I knew that the world did not know this story. And in fact, when I suggested that, they said, that's exactly what we want to do. And we're working with Taylor Branch. And they said, oh, of course, he's another hero of mine. And Taylor Branch wanted to do that as well. He said, let's base this doc on the last of my books, the what would have happened, like the last years of Dr. King. Those are the most interesting and the least known. I mean, they're most interesting now because they're the least known.
They're the least known. Great. Do you know whether or not there was a problem at all, or any pushback in getting the project off the ground with HBO, or they had to jump through it?
No, not at all. I mean, there's a sense that they had, the Kuhnhardts had made a lot of films before this. One on Warren Buffett that's very good. Just a series of several films, like biographies of people. So they have a deal at HBO, and they said, so HBO said, for the 50th anniversary, we'd like a film about King in some kind of way. So they gave us a lot of latitude to pitch it at this, to come at it at this angle.
Gotcha. Well, one of the amazing things about this film are the people that you interviewed, and obviously you mentioned interviewing with Taylor Branch. People, I mean, a number of them are household names like Andy Young, John Lewis, Harry Belafonte, Jesse Jackson. And of course, we've lost John Lewis and C.T. Vivian within the last year.
Right.
We died on the same day, in fact. But there are others that people don't know about, like Zernona Clayton, Clarence Jones, Bernard Lafayette, who all seem to have had major roles in what went on in Dr. King's life. So how did you handle that? How did you handle interviewing these giants?
Yeah, we went to the list. We knew that they were older people, right? So I mean, today is Harry Belafonte's birthday, and I want to say it's not 94. It's I forget. I just knew I forget. But today is his birthday, so let's all say happy birthday, Harry Belafonte.
Yeah.
I did all the interviews except for Harry Belafonte, Andy Young, and C.T. Vivian, who were very close friends of Taylor Branches, but I did all the rest. And certainly it was intimidating, but it was also they were just amazingly open. And I think at this point in their lives, many of them were very happy to talk. And also because we've done a lot of research. We had this amazing friend of mine who's the researcher and writer of the documentary, Chris Schwang, did amazing deep dives into all the stories. So when you're talking to them, most of them have not been interviewed for, like Bernard Lafayette, for 2 hours at a time. So it wasn't just King, it's about his work after that. His, like, really, we have in the Kuhnhart Educational Films website, we have the full interviews that are there for anybody to, and they're teaching tools around them and teaching lessons around them, so people can listen to them. We really wanted to capture all these people while they were still alive. And in fact, Dorothy Cotton, whose beautiful voice ends the film, it was the last interview she gave. So it was a lot of so I think that also the advantage of that also is that I think they had been they're very cliquish, very guarded about King's legacy. And then I think at this point, his legacy has been assured, and they're getting older. And so I think we talking to them long enough, we got to feel like we tell them we want King, the man, the one that you would see. So when Andy Young talks about, like, we're a bunch of kids and the pillow fights on the floor, I mean, that was just incredible how young they were. And Clarence Jones, just amazing, the depression and that, like, how the weight on him. And I think that's really that was also something we wanted to get across. And something to me as a dad that I always think about is Dr. King. He he had a heart, he had to balance his family life with his activism, right? So, but he'd come home and he's eating his food, and his kids are like, "Why are you so quiet, Daddy?" He's like, "I'm hungry. I'm trying to eat." And whenever, like, I'm trying to eat and do something, my kids are like hanging on my arms. I just think they can, like, Dr. King could do it, like I could do it. Like, I'm hungry. I'm trying to eat. It just makes me laugh. And so we tried to get as much as possible in this film, as much footage as we could of Dr. King, as without the Dr. King voice, like the regular voice, the telling jokes, the photos of him playing pool, the sense of the regular person, just as you said, to take him off the pedestal, off the monument, so that really to activate us. And in fact, we started the first day that when they contacted me to start working on the film, I think it was about 4 days after the election of Donald Trump. So that was certainly top of mind, thinking, how do we look back on activism back then to see what has been learned? What can we learn from nonviolent activism now compared to militarism and more radical movements, and seeing, like, how effective is it going to be to affect change?
By the way, when you did that and you were looking at those comparisons, did you arrive at any conclusions about some of those differences or lessons that should have been learned?
Yeah, I mean, a lot. I mean, my interview with John Lewis was just one of the most amazing things I've ever. I mean, I'm so glad I got to sit down with him for about an hour before he passed. And you think about him. I think about him and how he the push out of when SNCC said all white people out of SNCC, the sort of the turn of the movement then, and how that should have changed everything. And I think Elijah Cummington and John Lewis would talk about this. Like, like when they see, for example, when people talk about defund the police, as a slogan, right? Not as a thing of like, we need comprehensive police reform because modern day policing is broken, and it comes out of American policing comes out of the slave patrols. That's where we learned that's where the modern policing came. So we need radical reform, but calling it, for example, defund the police reminded them of like the whitey is the devil, or some things you can sort of say that makes you feel good in the moment. And
Right.
as a group of like-minded progressives, you can feel like, yeah, this is great, but then you've alienated a giant base of your potential allies and nothing gets done.
Yep. Burn, baby, burn. I remember a lot of the pressure when I was in college was to head in that direction versus any other direction. It's
Right.
it
So
was very serious.
right. So I just think of like the rabbit and the hare, and you think of like the work that Bernard Lafayette has done as a committed, nonviolent protester in all sort of walks of life, compared to someone whom I appreciated in some ways, as Stokely Carmichael, right? That Stokely Carmichael's activism fizzled out, and he ended up doing other things later in his life. Where Bernard Lafayette, Bernard Lafayette is like, until a couple of years ago, he was like in the prisons in Colombia talking to drug cartel members and trying to teach them like nonviolent conflict resolution. You know what I mean? I just think that the power of that. And then John Lewis is a great example. Like John Lewis, like having that staging that, remember these sort of sit-ins and die-ins on the congressional floor. I think it's the moral sway of that. Just saying this is our way, not out of being nonviolent, as Bernard Lafayette says, is radical. And I think that was really eye-opening for me as well.
Well, as you went through the process of interviewing these folks, was there anything that kind of bubbled to the top that surprised you overall?
Yeah, I mean, I did feel I got to know, there's a famous movie by Kurosawa, Rashomon, where it's like you tell a story from all different points of view. And
Yes.
I felt like by interviewing all these people around Dr. King, I felt like I got to know him in some ways, and which has just been, it was so delightful, but also sobering, especially from someone like Clarence Jones, when he talks so much about his depression. So I was surprised. I mean, but also how funny he was. I love when Andy Young talks about how the preaching each other's funerals, that kind of gallows humor, understanding that somebody that we're preaching nonviolence in a very ultra violent world that we understand, that we maybe as Americans are understanding now with the insurrection on the 6th of January, understanding that is really not gone away, and that kind of white supremacist terrorism is something that is not just, it's not just the South. And that's the other thing about the film that I love spending so much time in Chicago too, because the North was very smug about how backwards places like Tennessee, everywhere in the South was. And then when the chickens came home to roost in Chicago, that kind of the violence and the ugliness of Chicago was, I think, eye-opening to a lot of Americans.
Yeah, boy, does that come across in the film. I remember seeing that on television when I was younger. Just it was unbelievable. Shocking is the right word.
No, my age, I'm 50. I keep saying 55, 58. But 58, and remember like the school bus boycotts in Boston, and then I went to boarding school outside of Boston, and then coming into Boston and going to South Boston, getting off the bus and running, and then in New Haven running through, West Haven, where people are saying, go back to the jungle, and diving through backyards to get on the bus so they didn't get beat up. I mean, and it's crazy. I just sort of say it sort of casually. My kids are like, "What? Like how?"
That was reality.
Like that. It's like I was trying to go to this place, and it's like these people are yelling, and it's like, so you run. It just was crazy.
Yeah, my goodness. Oh, I think one of the things I kind of mentioned before was this idea of staying in his lane and getting out of his lane. And as I was looking at it, I'm thinking the idea that a Black preacher could be kind of the comprehensive visionary for the entire nation was something at that time that was absolutely unfathomable. It was all, I mean, even moving out just enough to cover the North and going up to Cicero in Illinois seemed like that was out of his lane. When you start talking about Vietnam and the economy and capitalism and those kind of things, it's like, wait a minute, this is crazy. It's just, my question is, did you get a sense that had he lived, that his team was ready for this kind of an expansion?
Yeah, it's hard to tell because I mean certainly there was like the rivalry, and that's I think that Jesse Jackson was so open in ways that he hadn't been before about like, I love this moment when he talks about, I understand the pressure he felt as a leader, and because at the time Jesse was really seen as like the young sort of usurper in this group, because he was sort of late coming in, he was younger than them coming into this group, and the flashy charismatic one, and he's a quarterback in the football team, all that stuff. So I think it's hard to say how ready they were, but I think that what I love about King and his journey is like, you think about being there, sort of sent from the sort of, he could have stayed at Ebenezer and being the junior minister to his dad, and then inherited this really fancy church and been terrific, right? But they going to Montgomery and then being in the beginning of this movement. It's so small, right? Starting with the bus boycott, it's such a small potatoes. And then to open up to like voting rights and the Selma March, and it gets a little bigger, it becomes at least statewide. And then Southern-wide, I think even like the trash strike later, but really going to the North and segregation in the North. Like, let's talk about segregation as a national issue is bigger. So he's still thinking bigger. And then I love that he goes to, let's talk about the war. Right, so that's, he's still thinking, okay, here's my moral compass. My moral compass says, I think I see them as these concentric rings as they're expanding out. And then when he gets to the Poor People's March, I love when Bernard Lafayette, it's just so funny saying, should I ask the and he's like, are they poor? And it's like, that's just so funny. Like, you just really got a sense of like Dr. King, just like saying, this, look, are they poor? This is the world. It's like this issue is as big as we want it to be, and he could just dream that big. I think it was just breathtaking.
Oh yeah, that one was absolutely, it is the whole thing. One of the things that hit me also, I was kind of looking at other things that happened around the same time. It's Dr. King's death. The Kerner Commission report in 1968. The Kerner Commission that was put together by Lyndon Johnson to take a look at race and the recurrent riots that had happened in the 60s all the way up to 67 to find out what needed to be done and what was going on. And I do remember their quote, which was that America had developed in such a way that it was literally two countries, one black, one white, both separate and unequal. But in reading, I just found out that Dr. King had actually said that his assessment was it's a physician's warning of approaching death with a prescription for life. I had never heard that. So that tells me that 2 months before his death, he'd gotten to the point where I'm not even sure he was being covered the same way he would have been covered in earlier years when he would have made a statement like that.
Right, the whole like House on Fire speeches, it's just amazing things. And I got to say, with Secretary Califano, those interviews were really interesting in terms of really like talking about Johnson and really sort of behind the scenes of the the riots and all that was really interesting. And to plug to West, he's another Westporter. He lives in Westport part of the year as well.
Yeah. So I said, by the way, when you talk to him, maybe this is another urban myth, but I always felt kind of that King had the protection of Lyndon Johnson, protecting him from J. Edgar Hoover and what was going on. And when he started to speak out against the war, some of that might have been pulled back a little bit. Did you get any sense that Johnson really had kind of just thrown him under the bus to some extent, or was he still engaged with him?
I didn't get that feeling, and I know I've seen the play LBJ, and I'm doing another talk with Sam Pollard, who did another documentarian, did the MLK Hoover tapes, this new documentary, right?
Right.
that's supposed to be fantastic. So I'm really interested to hear them. And we tried to talk to like we couldn't get him on. We couldn't identify him exactly, but I'm curious about this documentary. The head of finances for the SCLC, King's organization, was an informant. So and he's gone on to work for all sort of rise up in state office in Georgia. So that's made me think, of course, about Judas and the Black Messiah too. This idea of that, but the LBJ play, if you've seen it, I think I think Johnson. I mean, obviously Johnson is, history's, the Civil Rights Acts. He's really done amazing for a white Southerner, and the stuff he said about very cogently about like the reason these, the white animus towards blackness, it's really been, he would identify how that was rooted in classism. As somebody who really understood, like that's how the ruling class keeps in power in America, by keeping the poor blacks and poor whites and blacks who are over, predominantly poor at the time, at each other's throats. So I think Johnson did fantastic things. He both of them, I think, were pragmatists. I think they both used each other in very clever ways. But I do think that certainly he had that ammunition from Hoover, and I do think that without a different president, wouldn't have been could have thrown him under the bus much worse, because Hoover, we know now. I mean, Hoover. But more than anybody, like he really wanted to get after King. So I'm not sure I think he was disappointed about the war, but I think obviously Johnson understood that he was not pro-war either. He was saddled with this thing and didn't have any good ways to get out either. Yeah. So I think it wasn't just like, it's not like Nixon, like I'm pro-war. Nixon, I think, was more like, we're just trying to win this war, or try to win. I think Johnson felt like he was much more weighing. He understood that this is, pointless, and the people dying there are Americans, or the treasure we're losing is just heartbreaking.
Unbelievable. Well, you mentioned the new film too by Sam Pollard, which I have not seen, but just having read, he's got new information, I take it, from the tapes that have been released from the FBI. And one of the things that seems hinted at by the folks you interviewed is that there was certainly a personal side to Dr. King's life when he was on the road, that today would have been salacious and all over the news and so on. I wondered whether or not you ran into that and decided not to head down that path explicitly.
Well, I think we had, people, especially Clarence Jones said, look, was he the greatest, father or the greatest husband in the world? He says, no, he wasn't. I think at that time, I mean, it's a very different time that, the not just the pressure, the preacher's rock star, every single from LBJ to like, I think you'd be hard pressed to find a politician or man, like a man of power in America at that time that, didn't fool around. Like, sexism was so absolute that they had almost this free pass to do whatever they want, because they could do whatever, they're just like it's hard to understand for ourselves, at least for me, even how different the world was. Women would tell me, like older, like they get in a elevator in the congressional office building, and they just like grab her butt or grab her boobs and just laugh it off. It's just like, this is like, you know what I mean? Just like in ways that like that our kids can the world, we've come so far as a world, which is great, but just like we're in ways you cannot even imagine, like how terrible that behavior was. And not to, obviously it continued more into the Matt Lauer age, but especially down there, we're talking about in the 60s. I think we didn't want to run away from it. We didn't want to dwell on it. We didn't want to define him with that. But I think it's just part of his, how real he was as a real person.
I know you went on from this. You won an Emmy Award for this film, and then went on and won another Emmy in your next film.
Right there.
Right there, beautiful. For the and it was a brilliant documentary. Both of them were brilliant, but this one was Brian's a documentary that of really Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy, and really about his life and his movement and everything else that he's done.
And the creation of the monuments, and the museum and the museum, the legacy museum and the history of slavery to mass incarceration, and plus the memorial to the victims of lynching.
And I, by the way, I highly recommend the film. I also highly recommend that folks get down there as soon as they're able to with COVID the way it is, and take a look at what's down there with the museum and the monument that's there. I just wondered if you felt there were parallels between both the periods and the subjects that you covered in both films.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to do that as the next documentary. It's sort of, we had already started thinking about that while we were finishing the King documentary, and to work on something more, in some ways, more contemporary, because he was alive, and him and his clients, just was really life changing. But also, he wanted to talk about the history of from slavery to mass incarceration, which allowed us to sort of make a film that was bigger than just like his law practice, and bigger than just the creation of these memorials. So I think it was really, really, I think it was really important and interesting. And the fact that we did it all right before, we finished it all before the summer of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. I think if you look at it, I think it really says a lot of really interesting, sort of vital things, vital information about the criminal justice system and how perverse it is right now.
Mm.
Well, and Brian, as a person, of course, I mean, he's not a preacher, but he was raised in the church. He certainly has that preacherly voice. That's it's a big part of his life. So I think he certainly is part of that. And it's amazing that like these people are still alive. So when he talks really movingly, we have in the film where he got there as a young man to Montgomery, and there's like Ms. Rosa Parks. So he's like hanging out talking to Rosa Parks, and all these other and the women around the bus boycott, and Fred Gray is still alive, and he was the lawyer for them. He was also the lawyer for the Tuskegee experiment men, and the lawyer for Rosa Parks. I mean, and he's still alive. So it's like to meet these people. And what's her name from the before Rosa Parks, the young woman who was first on the bus.
First on the bus. I don't know her name, but I know what you mean. She was she was 16 years old or something.
Yeah, my son Chetty, wrote papers about her. She's like amazing. Everyone, I'm sure someone will put something in the notes, but I forget. But like she's still alive. So at the opening for the grand opening for the museum, he's calling these people up, and you're just like, I can't. What? How can you just like you get to shake these people's hands? It was crazy. It's like they just like stepped right out of the history.
Incredible. Well, we do have a couple of questions. The first is that from the audience, the documentary showed how prominent some women played in Dr. King's life and his movement. How much influence do they really have, including Coretta Scott King?
Right. Someone said, Claudette Colvin, that's her name. And the fact that she's not Claudette Colvin, I mean, the fact she's still alive is amazing. And there are great children's books about her, and she's becoming more and more a household name, and I apologize for not remembering her name. We were really determined to talk to as many of the women of the movement as we could. Zernona Clayton she was the first interview we did. She was just priceless. Dorothy Cotton, his personal assistant, was with him wherever he went on the road. Really was fantastic. The Diane Nash is really like a radical thinker, superstar. I mean, who's deserving of like her own biopic. I mean, she really was like really like fearless in going from with John Lewis at the in the lunch counters at Fisk, then moving into the South, and like really really laying the groundwork for the voting rights in Mississippi marches and the Selma to Montgomery march. I mean, she's just an amazing person. So they were really, really integral in a world that was really super sexist. So again, like we didn't talk about Rosa Parks, but I was working on there's this the new biography of Rosa Parks by the woman. But Theodoros, Jeanette Theodoros, I think her name is. It's an excellent book about how radical she was. Her dad was a Garveyite. They're living in Montgomery. She was really progressive. Her husband worked on the army base, the Air Force base there, cutting black and white guys' hair. They're at a certain level and understanding that she was really always working with the NAACP. They understood that she was like taking this. Though she made the decision a little bit like today I'm just tired, like a little bit of an improvisation. They'd known from Claudia Colvin and the Emmett Till and all these things that had come up before. And Brian Stevenson talks about this other terrible, horrible case in Montgomery of a boy who was, is electric. He was killed in the electric chair because for having a relationship with this consensual relationship with a white woman. So all that stuff was weighing on her. But then the way that the system, not just, it wasn't King's fault, but they just took it away from Rosa Parks because it's like, she's a woman, she can't be the face of this movement. And they just wanted her as sort of a figurehead. So we didn't get into the sexism of that world, of this sort of band of boys, this boys club of Andy Young and Jesse Jackson and Bernard Lafayette and all these guys in this world. I think they're sort of, certainly they're part of their world. I think King himself, having a very strong wife and he had very strong women around him. I think he was doing his best, but they were really steeped in a history of sexism that made it sort of hard for women to rise up. But that said, the work of the women in the civil rights movement. I mean, the Ella Bakers, the camps, that they sort of the underground sort of training, that how the women had to figure out, especially in the South, behind enemy lines, as it were, because it really was life threatening. How they had to smile and say, "Oh, I'm just sewing. I'm just doing this. Don't worry about me." The cunning they had to use to affect change is just really, I think, really remarkable.
Yeah, and when you also back up and go back into the 1800s and you look at the incredible women leaders like Harriet Tubman and Ida B. Lewis and others that came along, it's just incredible.
Right, but it's the March on Washington. I mean, like they didn't allow. There were great women that should have had prominent speaking roles and didn't. So certainly the civil rights movement, like the anti-war movement, like a lot of these movements, like the men were very progressive in a lot of ways, but regressive in terms of
that way
dealing with women.
Well, as a scholar, I mean, we just went through you've won awards for books, for essays. You've done films that are feature films. You've done television. You've done documentaries, and you've been a star at every one of those things you've done. But one of the things you did as a scholar was to coin the term the new Black aesthetic, which, as I understand it, and I probably got too simplistic an understanding, but it's new ways of being for Black people that are outside the typical stereotypical kind of view about what you're going to do. You can go to college and become a doctor. You can go in college, become a lawyer, that kind of thing. But you don't do the unusual things like you have done in your life.
Right. I was a senior in college at Stanford, and I was reading about the Black aesthetic, but it was a collection of essays by this guy Addison Gale. And when people would talk about the Black aesthetic, they would say, "Oh, the Black aesthetic is, Africa and the drum and its rhythm and its, kitty cloth," or whatever. They just sort of had a narrow Black nationalist idea of what a Black aesthetic would be, and it had to be sort of through this kind of radical political frame. And I was thinking, well, I grew up in Hamden, Connecticut, in a pretty, I was like the only Black kid on my side of town, and then it ended up at Hopkins in New Haven, and then at Andover after that. Always like sort of this minority, but I was listening to Joni Mitchell, and my dad would have Earl Garner and great jazz, and Hale Jackson. So I was just mismatch of cultures, and it occurred to me that I just thought that my point of view was actually valid. So I started writing about it and talking about it, and now we take it a little more for granted because it's that was 40 years ago. But at the time, this idea of like this what I call the new NBA, which I like the pun on that the new Black aesthetic is to say that Blackness isn't just anything. It's this multitude, and it's sort of allowing Black artists to flourish in all sorts of genres. And we see much more of that today, where Black culture is more profuse than ever in all sorts of ways, from country to hockey players to everything. So just like, so this idea of like, oh, the first Black is sort of boring to me, but the idea that Blackness itself can sort of take all sorts of forms.
Fantastic. Well, can you tell us anything about your current and your planned projects right now?
Yeah, I'm looking at my room of different. I've got always a bunch of different things going. I'm, I've written a play about. It started as a movie, then a TV show. I'm sort of developing it as a play about Amos and Andy called Holy Mackerel, and it's the first one of the first TV shows before, but first sitcoms before I Love Lucy, the first to be live, the first to laugh track, all that kind of stuff. I Love Lucy came in 6 months later. It got nominated for an Emmy, lost to I Love Lucy in the fourth annual Emmys Awards in '53. So it's just a really interesting story about representation. It was pulled off the air by Walter White, the head of the NAACP, who hated the show because Amos and Andy famously was a groundbreaking radio show developed by these two white guys who would voice many of the parts, the main parts. And they really did come out of minstrelsy. So certainly there are a lot of reasons that, like, Black folks like my parents, who are kind of like snooty and very upper middle class, just like would not watch it. But I talked to other Black people in interviewing them, or even like Skip Gates, who was raised in West Virginia, in Piedmont, West Virginia, with not much money. His family loved it to death. So he actually, I thank him again. He's the one that came through with this idea. So that's percolating. I'm also writing, because of that, I got a job. I've just finished writing a musical, which I've never done before. And I've written the lyrics and the book for a musical about Dorothy Dandridge, this groundbreaking Black actress who was nominated for Academy Award for Carmen Jones. And we're just in the beginnings of table reads and stuff now. I started writing it right before COVID, so I've written it through COVID, and now as we're coming out, we're starting to, start to put it up on its feet, and hopefully, it'll go towards Broadway with the producers and the production team that I have. Those are the two things that are sort of taking up a lot of my time. I'm also writing a podcast about a fictional podcast about social justice for the Kellogg Foundation. And that's just now, because I've never done that before. So I like to do new things. So like when I lived in LA for a long time. When I moved to New York to start teaching at Columbia, I started writing more plays. So I've now written 3 of them, and then this musical, there'll be a 4th. And then I started the documentaries with King of the Wilderness and True Justice. And then I got this, the musical. I thought, let me try writing some lyrics. And then when the opportunity for working on a podcast came up, I thought, I'm really interested. My kids are super interested in them. I want to sort of understand the form and take a look at it and see how it works.
Goodness gracious. I mean, you're the epitome of the new Black aesthetic. I mean, it's incredible, just incredible. That's wonderful. There is another question that came up as well, which is, who do you see as emerging leaders today from the Black Lives Matter movement and beyond?
Yeah, I think the world is a lot more, because of social media, it's a lot more democratic. So like BLM, for example, is like a consortium of people. And then so some of them become more famous than others talking. And then I think that I'm where I feel hopeful. I think it's bigger than the movement. And that's what Diane Nash wanted to talk about. Like she's still fighting that fight, and was saying that it's not about, like, that's really the reason to going back to why the film in the first place. If you say that you have to wait for like the Messiah to come, and King's got to break out of the, like, lightning's got to strike that statue on the mall, and then he's got to come down like Godzilla and say, and now change things. It's not going to happen, right? So how do we do that? If you understand that he is a regular person and we can all get together. So I think people like Reverend William Barber, like taking up the Poor People's Month right now. So I think that, and Brian Stevenson and AOC And I think that, and John Lewis when he was alive, I think that just like there are a lot of people doing really smart things, and I think just pushing in the right direction. So I think we all have a role to play as opposed to waiting for one person.
Beautiful, beautiful way to go. I'm just going to kind of sum it up by saying that, James Baldwin talked about the big lie that we're not equal, the big lie of racism that's been out there all these years. There was a movie, I'm Not Your Negro, which really should have been the other N word, which I think was his quote. But the bottom line was, we've been unpacking for the last 400 years a lot of that big lie, and to a very real extent, where we ran into boundaries like Dr. King being looked at in a certain lane and other people only being able to get so far because people aren't ready to hear anymore, has been how far we'd unpacked to date some of that lie and some of the racism that steeps through everything we do. I just want to say that while we had, back 50 years ago, we had King, Malcolm, Panthers, John Lewis, Stokely Carmichael, Baldwin. Now we've got Kendi and Wilkerson and Cloud and Heather McGee and the 1619 Project and Black Lives Matter. It's all revisiting the limits of the unresolved gaps between Black and or people of color and the other folks here in this country, our common history and our common narrative that have to get resolved. And I just want to say thank you so much for the work you've done to help us move farther in that process as a country. I really very much appreciate it.
Oh, and thank you. Thank you for your work in this town and making this town a hospital. Before I've gotten here, like raising, 4 kids here in this town, and thanks to you for your work. And before we go, I'd also like to say I'm thinking a lot about Asian American hate crimes these days, and how we all have that. It's easy to say, sort of, for Black people, and especially with the summer and these murders, to think that it's really a black and white issue. But this kind of the ugliness is really around people of color in writ large, and I think we really have to figure out how we can fight that all together. And I think that we figure out how we can really make make America live up to its promises and be really much more inclusive as progressives as well too, and not so segregated in our own lanes.
Amen. Well, thanks again. I very much appreciate it. Trey.
Oh, thank you for having us.
And I just want to thank the both of you because that was just such a great conversation. Really, guys, thank you so much for that. Trey, thank you for your important work, and being able to write in every discipline is something that I'm jealous of, and really like unbelievable. So thank you for that. And Harold, I hope I say it enough, but I probably don't. It's really awesome working with you and Team Westport. And as Trey mentioned, the town appreciates you. So thank you for doing this. And Trey, thank you again for your work and being accessible to the community, because it's such an important piece, what we do, what you guys just did here. So we appreciate it. And we can't wait for whatever you have next. We're happy to, we'd be thrilled and honored to have you back.
Yeah, I can't wait to get back in the library and just pretty much live in the library like I usually do with my kids.
Yeah, my stupid screen. I'm getting tired of this virtual world, but yeah. And to all of you out there, thank you so much for being here tonight. And thank you for watching the film and for participating. To everybody, have a good night. Stay safe. Stay well. Good night, everybody.
Take care.